Hello. 1st of March. Time flies, having fun. Weekly Marx. I'm doing a little bit more on Marx again. More specifically about von Bauwerk or Bawerk and uh, Joan Robinson. And the reason why I got there was because I came across a actually fairly new article on something that involves classical stuff, but done by someone who is associated with the National Bureau of Economic Research and is at, oh heavens to Betsy, Harvard. Paul Antros and Vitaly Tubdanov done a little paper called Measuring the Average Period of Production. And it's interesting in that it mentions, of course, the Austrian capital theory proposed by von Bawerk and further elaborated by Wixell, Hicks, Dorfman, and a bunch of other folks. But the point of this, of course, is to raise the question that Marx comes up with about averages, and in this particular case, in the classical context, the average period of production, which governs the demand for circulating capital associated with the production process. And so these folks, these two guys, propose a measure of the average period of production as a weighted average temporal distance, a weighted average temporal distance between the time at which a firm employs its inputs and the time at which these inputs deliver finished goods that are sold to consumers. So, you're looking at a production period. We show that under stationary conditions, this measure corresponds to the ratio of a firm's stock of inventories to the cost of goods it sells in a given period. And using data from publicly traded companies worldwide, we compute and validate this measure for various industries and countries and show that, consistent with theory, this measure is lower the higher the cost of capital faced by firms is. So production takes time. From the extraction and preparation of raw materials to the design, manufacturing, assembly, and distribution of finished goods. Each step entails a distinct duration influenced by technological and economic factors. The importance of time in production was emphasized by classical economists, including David Ricardo and Karl Marx, and was at the core of the capital theory proposed by von Bawerk in 1889. This Austrian capital theory was somewhat anticipated by Jevons in 1871 and is further elaborated by Wixell in 1934, Hicks in 1939, and Dorfman in 1959, among others. A central concept in this literature is the existence of an average period of production, which governs the demand for circulating capital associated with the production process. This old literature invokes several examples to illustrate the benefits of longer, more working capital intensive production processes. Jevons and Wixell described the problem of a tree planter who needs to decide when to harvest a forest to maximize returns. If the trees are cut down too early, they yield little lumber or little timber and profit. If left to grow longer, the trees increase in size and their economic value rises, but the planter must wait longer for the returns. Similarly, von Bawerk mentioned wine aging to demonstrate how time adds value to goods through production processes that are inherently dependent on waiting. These examples highlight the trade-off between immediate returns and the gains from a longer production process. These examples also hint at a natural connection between production length and interest rates, as the tree planter and wine producer must weigh the time value of money against the increased output from waiting. The benefits of longer production processes are not limited to these stylized examples. In modern manufacturing processes, the need for care and precision often leads to trade-offs in which longer production processes are favored despite the higher associated working capital needs. Beyond manufacturing, time is crucial for research and development. The pharmaceutical production process often spans 10 or 15 years for a single drug, involving discovery, preclinical testing, and multiple phases of clinical trials. Each phase is designed to ensure the drug's safety and efficacy, but the long duration highlights the enormous time investment required before market approval. Time impacts costs significantly. Estimates suggest that in the biopharmaceutical industry, over $1 billion is required to bring a new compound to market, with much of the expense tied to sustaining operations during prolonged R&D efforts. Building on the work of Baum-Bavarick and Hicks, in this paper we propose a measure of the average period of production, or APP, defined as a weighted average temporal distance between the time at which a firm employs its inputs and the time at which these inputs deliver finished goods that are sold to consumers. In section 2, we develop the theoretical underpinnings of this measure and study how it's shaped by the cost of capital faced by firms. In section 3, we develop specific examples that connect with prior theoretical work on the topic. In section 4, we show that under stationary conditions, this measure corresponds to the ratio of a firm's stock of inventories to the cost of goods it sells in a given period, opening the door for empirical explorations of the average period of productions, APP, in a wide range of sectors. Using data from publicly traded companies in section 5 and 6, we compute this measure for firms and industries in several countries, and we show that, consistent with the theory, this measure increases as the cost of capital faced by firms decreases. We also find that the ranking of industries by their average period of production is quite stable across countries. This suggests that there are important technological determinants of production length that shape the temporal dimension of certain production processes, regardless of where they're conducted, a feature that is reminiscent of the absence of factor intensity reversals in neoclassical trade theory. Furthermore, we find that industries with longer production processes tend to feature higher skill intensity but lower physical capital intensity, pointing to an interesting dichotomy between physical capital intensity and working capital intensity. So this is, very basic on the one hand, on the other hand, fundamental. And I'll skip to the conclusion. In this paper, we've developed a measure to capture the temporal dimension of production. Building on the Austrian capital theory of Baum-Bavarick, 1889, we defined the average period of production as a weighted average temporal distance between the time a firm employs its inputs and the time these inputs deliver finished goods to consumers. Under stationary conditions, this measure corresponds to a ratio of a firm's stock of inventories to the cost of goods it sells in a given period, making it readily computable using data from publicly traded companies worldwide. Consistent with theoretical predictions, we demonstrated that firms facing higher capital costs tend to exhibit shorter average production periods. Our ultimate aim is to foster further empirical research into how production length and interest rates shape industrial structure. Recent work by Antras has explored the theoretical connections between interest rates and comparative advantage in models of international trade and global value chains. The measure developed in this paper provides a foundation for empirically testing these Austrian theories of international specialization. More generally, we hope that our measure will find broader application across fields, offering new insights into the interplay between production length, financial conditions, and industrial structure. All seems relatively straightforward, although I think the point is, of course, to go back to Baum-Bavarick and see and note that he, of course, has a certain critique of Marx, challenging Marx's sort of inconsistencies, of the logical inconsistency of the labor theory of value, and note, of course, that we've sort of transcended the problem, but it sort of sticks around and, in fact, manifests itself actually in this kind of literature that discusses production time. But anyway, that's getting too far ahead of ourselves. Terry Eagleton writes that Marx's writings should not be taken to mean that everything that has happened is a matter of class struggle. It means, rather, that class struggle is most fundamental to human history. And I think that you can argue that without a lot of problems. It is clear, of course, that as Marx is writing, he's talking more specifically about class struggle in a very specific mode of production called capitalism. And while there are formative class divisions in a variety of other historical instances, you just can't make yourself too crazy about it because often over determining your kind of argument with that kind of idea, of course, makes it less credible and unfalsifiable and all those other good things. Shimson Bickler and Johann Nitzen, Bickler and Nitzen, argue that most studies purporting to show empirical evidence of the labor theory of value often make methodological errors by comparing the total labor value to total price of multiple economic sectors, which results in a strong overall correlation, but this is a statistical exaggeration. The authors argue that the correlations between labor value and price in each sector are often very small, if not insignificant. Bickler and Nitzen also argue that it is difficult to quantify a way to measure abstract labor. Researchers are forced to make assumptions. So, because it is difficult to quantify a way to measure abstract labor, researchers are forced to make assumptions. However, Bickler and Nitzen argue these assumptions involve circular reasoning, stating the most important of these assumptions is that the value of labor power is proportionate to the actual wage rate, that the ratio of variable capital to surplus value is given by the price ratio of wages to profit, and occasionally also that the value of the depreciated constant capital is equal to a fraction of the capital's money price. In other words, the researcher assumes precisely what the labor theory of value is supposed to demonstrate. And yes, there's a circularity and problematic elements, and although you could argue in a different direction, but we won't do that here. Distorted or absent price signals. The economic calculation problem is a criticism of socialist economics, or more precisely, of centralized socialist planned economies. It was first proposed by Austrian school economist Ludwig von Mises in 1920 and later expounded by Friedrich Hayek. The problem referred to is that of how to distribute resources rationally in an economy. Now, the free market solution is the price mechanism, wherein people individually have the ability to decide how a good should be distributed based on their willingness to give money for it. The price conveys embedded information about the abundance of resources as well as their desirability, which in turn allows, on the basis of individual consensual decisions, correction, consensual on the basis of individual consensual decision corrections that prevent shortages and surpluses. Mises and Hayek argued that this is the only possible solution, and without the information provided by market prices, socialism lacks a method to rationally allocate resources. Now, the debate raged in the 1920s and 30s, because they're obviously opposing, the Soviet Union. And that specific period of the debate has come to be known by economic historians as the socialist calculation debate. In practice, socialist states like the Soviet Union used mathematical techniques, heaven forfend, to determine and set prices with mixed results. Inconsistency. Vladimir Karpovich Dmitriev, writing in 1898, Ladislav von Borkowitz, writing in 1906 to 1907, and subsequent critics have alleged that Karl Marx's value theory and law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall are internally inconsistent. In other words, these critics, and I'm looking at these are criticisms of Marxism in general on the one hand, on the other, very specifically, or addressing value issues. So, in other words, the critics allege that Marx drew conclusions that do not actually follow from his theoretical premises. Once those errors are corrected, Marx's conclusions that aggregate price and profit are determined by and equal to aggregate value and surplus value no longer holds true. This result calls into question his theory that the exploitation of workers is the sole source of profit. Now, the back end of this argument is what counts as exploitation, and do you particularize it, or can you actually cleave off, as is done with surplus value, some way of measuring exploitation, which is its own, sort of crazy little argument, well, it's a crazy big argument, and for some folks remains insoluble, mainly because it does apply arbitrary elements, problematic identification, and et cetera, et cetera. The inconsistency allegations have been a prominent feature of Marxian economics and debate surrounding it since the 1970s. Andrew Kleiman argues that since internally inconsistent theories cannot possibly be right, this undermines Marx's critique of political economy and current day research based upon it, as well as the correction of Marx's alleged um, inconsistencies. So, um, baby bathwater, etc. But it is an important challenge to certain features, and often it is a matter of sort of making sure that you've defined the problem adequately at the front end. Critics who have alleged that Marx has been proved internally inconsistent include former and current Marxian and/or Sraffian economists such as Paul Sweezy, Nobuo Okishio, or Okishio, Ian Steedman, John Romer, Gary Mangiovi, and David Leibman, who propose that the field be grounded in their correct versions of Marxian economics instead of in Marx's critique of political economy in the original form in which he presented and developed it in Capital. Now, the reason, of course, to go back and read Volume 1 of Capital, and particularly with its new translation, is to sort of work through to see whether there's anything else that sort of can be culled from that, and to note how the path of transcendence, as some people have put it, is going in terms of a more material or dialectically material analysis. Proponents of the temporal single system interpretation in the TSSI of Marx's value theory, like Kleiman, claim that the supposed inconsistency are actually the result of misinterpretation. There's a lot of literature on this. And argue that when Marx's theory is understood as temporal and single system, the alleged internal inconsistencies disappear. And in fact, when you start talking about these time of production process, as I tried to introduce with that new article, there's a kind of reflection that's worthwhile sort of considering. In a recent survey of debate, Kleiman concludes that the proofs of inconsistency are no longer defended. The entire case against Marx has been reduced to the interpretive issue. So, this underlies a question of falsifiability, whether, how law-like is it, all kinds of other things, which are problematic and worthy criticisms of Marxism. And on that same note, came across a new article, relatively new article, in a series on Joan Robinson on Karl Marx's Sense of Reality is Far Stronger by Carolina Alves, who is at Cambridge, I think. And so here's a section from it, and I think you can see that there is some relation. That's why I do these little, audio things. As the Great Depression unfolded in the early 1930s, the received economic orthodoxy was under challenge at Cambridge University and pretty much everywhere else. The standard macroeconomic wisdom of the day was based on Say's law, that is, production process, that is, supply, generates the income necessary for the demand for these products, which offered no explanation for the collapse of output and commensurate rise in unemployment. Needless to say, that's important in the 30s. The microeconomic wisdom of the day included the idea that each of the factors of production, in particular labor and capital, was paid the marginal value of its output. At the time, the economic and political tectonic plates were shifting in Europe, which opened a space to question the orthodoxy of laissez-faire capitalism, and even to challenge what had often been the outright mockery of orthodox economists towards Marxism. At Cambridge, when John Maynard Keynes was formulating his challenge to the conventional wisdom in the early 1930s, he focused on how effective demand could fall short of what was needed to support full employment. But although Keynes was a fierce critic of the Say's law aspect of orthodox theory, he in fact left most of the theoretical and methodological grounds of economics intact. And yes, that's kind of the received wisdom on that. Economist Pierre Sraffa formed a discussion group known as the Cambridge Circus to discuss Keynes's work, but also to take a deep dive into the social problems associated with unemployment. Once immersed in this rich and vibrant intellectual environment, Joan Robinson started a lifelong journey to reconstruct economic theory. As a first step, she formulated the economics of imperfect competition, providing a theoretical base for thinking about profits and wages in an economy in the absence of competition. And clearly, you can see what's going on there relative to the 1930s. Her Cambridge colleagues Sraffa and Mikhail Kalecki took a more radical stance, drawing upon a Marxist framework for analysis. They discussed crises and the impossibility of an automatic mechanism for reestablishing the equilibrium of the system and placed the question of returns and distribution at the center of their analysis. They both took Marx's economics seriously, dissenting from the marginalist view that wages and returns to capital were determined by the marginal product of labor and capital, and instead beginning from the idea that capitalists would extract all they could from workers. Robinson became both a friendly critic and supporter of Keynes, and in the early 1930s, she provided elements for important developments in Keynes's thought. After Keynes published the General Theory in 1936, Robinson published her essays in the Theory of Employment the following year, retrospectively considered the very first post-Keynesian text. By the end of the 1930s, Robinson wanted to bring academic and Marxian economics together. Now, remember, this is decades before she ever gets to become a professor. But anyway, while also expecting Marx to make her economics more real, to address the inequities of the capitalist world, some of her like-minded contemporaries at Cambridge saw this as no more than a passing flirtation with Marx. However, Christina Marcuso, an expert in the Cambridge School of Economics, argues that Robinson had reached a fork in the road. That is, Robinson was unsatisfied with both orthodox economics and what would become known as Keynesian economics. On the one hand, Robinson was still searching for a more realist theory of the rate of profit and income distribution. On the other hand, she had reservations about Keynes's concept of full employment and wondered about the nature of technical progress and a long period history within the Keynesian framework. Of course, our current economic issues are not those of the Great Depression. However, we do live in a time where the United States, the United Kingdom, and other developed economies are experiencing a combination of high profit rates along with a falling labor share of income and the high and rising inequality. The question between capital and labor staggering and undeniable. Decades after Robinson's time, critical issues of profit and profit distribution and crisis mechanisms have not been fully addressed. Rather than simply attributing these patterns to shifts in the marginal product of labor and capital, one can instead investigate a heterodox view built on the bargaining power of capital and labor. In this essay, I begin with some brief biographical notes on Robinson. I then focus on Robinson's 1942 piece, an essay on Marxian economics, henceforth essay. I revisit why Robinson felt the need to turn to Marx and which insights from Marxian economics she sought to incorporate into her later works. I comment on the legacy of the essay and how it was received by some of her contemporaries. I conclude with some thoughts on how Robinson came to view herself as Marxist, although I would not label her work in that way. Robinson shook the foundations of the economics of her time, introducing the negatively sloped marginal revenue curve, coming up with concepts such as monopsony, confronting the marginalist theory of distribution, and popularizing the unconventional economics ideas of John Maynard Keynes. In particular, an essay on Marxian economics of 1942 is one of her three great works, the other two being The Economics of Imperfect Competition of 1933 and The Accumulation of Capital 1956. It is also the least well known, despite being the most important in terms of laying the foundations of her enduring challenge to orthodox economics. If in 1933 Robinson offered an internal critique of Marshallian value theory, by 1942, with the essay on Marxian economics, she relied on Marxian insights to escape Marshallian orthodoxy. It is the story of how the originator of imperfect competition pushed further towards into a theory of exploitation, as problematically mentioned above. And one needs to sort of, once one starts to be confronted by all this stuff, some of which has classical implications, you need to sort of look at Baum-Bawerk. Baum-Bawerk examines Marx's analysis of value, claiming the basic error in Marx's system to have resulted from a self-contradiction in Marx's law of value, namely, how the rate of profit and the prices of production of the third volume of Marx's Capital contradict Marx's theory of value in the first volume. Now, the point is, this is a kind of false comparison in the sense that, volume one is the only thing that gets published. Volumes two and three are collections, and, it's easy to have contradiction or divergence or questions. He also attacks Marx for downplaying the influence of supply and demand in determining permanent price and for deliberate ambiguity with such concepts. And so the piece Karl Marx and the Close of His System, written in 1896 for a series of independent essays on political science, Baum-Bawerk's work is held up as a classic criticism of Marxist economic theory. In Capital Volume 1, Marx explained the profits of capital as resulting from surplus value. He left open the problem of explaining how capitalists with differing ratios of labor to machinery, labor to capital, can have similar profits, a contradiction to be resolved in further works. We're talking about the transformation problem and a whole bunch of other things, but needless to say, there is, volume one and volume two and three, and they're not all the same in that sense. Marx in Capital Volume 3 takes up the matter again, but according to Baum-Bawerk's essay, does not resolve the issue logically. He concludes with a critique of his contemporary Werner Sombart's interpretation of Marx in Sombart's essay Zur Kritik der ökonomischen Systems von Karl Marx. And so this article by Alves has a set of final remarks. I have Marx in my bones. Robinson quote from 1953. Robinson never fully accepted Marx's argument that exploitation was a cause of increasing misery of the industrial working class, and she did not follow the most revolutionary implications of Marxian economics. That's easy to do in many ways because it's just hard. It's a difficult argument. However, she found Marx's insights and ideas much more powerful for explaining reality than either the dominant Marshallian economics that she'd been taught or the newly developing Keynesian economics of her time. She may not have adopted Marx's historical materialism, that is, dialectical method, where there is a continuous state of change resulting from interaction and conflicts, but Marx solidified in Robinson a path she saw starting with the Keynesian revolution regarding moving from the conception of equilibrium to the conception of history. Later in life, Robinson will look back at her encounter with Marx in the 1930s and 40s and say that for her, the main message of Marx was the need to think in terms of history, not of equilibrium. Marx offers a long-run analysis with references to short-run declines in profit and investment, but he does not think in terms of equilibrium. Instead, Marx takes into account the dynamic character of the economy not as a succession of static states, but rather as economic processes whose movement from period to period lead to ongoing changes, and thus to an economic system that over time moves into disequilibrium. From Robinson's perspective, this way of thinking is much more than noting that economic concepts and relationships are influenced by their historical and social setting. It is also about differentiating historical time from logical time. As Robinson later put it, historical time moves from the dark past behind it into the unknown future in front, while logical time can be traced from left to right on the surface of a blackboard. If we accept that the economy exists in time, our economic analysis must consider the difference between theories dealing with logical time and those dealing with historical time. Although Robinson was still very much influenced by a tendency to moralize economics as a way of improving the world, which can be viewed as a legacy of the Marshallian economics she'd been taught, she made very clear that Marx's condemnation of the existing economic system was not merely about its moral repugnance. For Marx, periodic crisis and trade cycles were symptoms of a deep-seated and progressive malady in the vitals of the system. In contrast with the complacency of the orthodox academics who preach the gloomy doctrine that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, dismal science stuff, right? In this sense, for Robinson, Marx was ultimately encouraging because he opens Pandora's box and releases terror, but also hope. That said, Robinson's radicalness seems to have roots before her encounter with Marx and even Keynes. Indeed, in her 1953 essay on rereading Marx, she wrote an open letter from a Keynesian to a Marxist stating that she was a left-wing Keynesian long before the general theory, Keynes's general theory, was published, and therefore also before her investigation of Marx. Her pre-Marx frustrations and critique of economics and capitalism are what seem to have made her state that she had Marx in her bones without the need, quote, of Hegelian stuff and nonsense. I believe Robinson's critique and praise of Marx were part of a genuine attempt to bring both Marx to economics and to make Marxian concepts intelligible and relevant for macroeconomists and applied macro research. For Robinson, quote, it surely should be possible to adopt a language in which the two parties could talk to each other, unquote. Some scholars like to highlight how Robinson tried to bring together macroeconomics and Marxian economic theory, stripping the ideological baggage of the latter. However, they often miss Robinson's urge to disentangle ideology from any economic theory, including not just Marx, but also Marshall or Keynes. She was always alert to distinctions between the intentions and the implications of an author. Robinson wrote, Marx's analysis of capitalism shows its strong points, although his purpose was to attack it. Marshall's argument inadvertently shows the wastefulness of capitalism, although he meant to recommend it. Keynes, in showing the need for remedies to the defects of capitalism, also shows how dangerous the remedies may be. In my view, that is in Alves's view, Robinson examined Marx as one would approach any object of study, pointing out weaknesses and coming up with constructive criticism while also acknowledging its strengths. He was interested in the progress of economic theory, not in the abstract sense, but rather in terms of whether that theory was able to account for actual economic phenomena. I would not call Robinson a Marxist more than I would call her a Keynesian or a member of any other school of thought. She was an original thinker who craved a better economics and was willing to look everywhere for the tools to build one. So from Alves's text, which is generally, I skipped a bunch of stuff, and that is to introduce Robinson as a much broader thinker than, a Marxian or anti-Marxian or post-Keynesian or blah, 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 is to sort of work through exactly what the process is now. And there are some major streams of thought that are very, very important. That need to be transcended or at least to be critiqued in that way. That is, of course, Keynesianism, Marshallian methodology, and of course Marxian concepts. So how would we approach that kind of problem? One way to look at that is, well, to look at let's look at some other quotes to sort of maybe get a better idea. Marxist economist Ernest Mandel identifies Karl Marx and the close of his system, the Baum-Bavaric, as part of a literature beginning with the German social democrat Edward Bernstein that criticizes the dialectical method Marx borrowed from George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel as useless, metaphysical, or mystifying. He faults Baum-Bavaric and the other critics for what he regards as their positivist narrowness. And you can argue that in fact it is, but that most, whether it's neoclassical or even heterodox economics, there is a certain positivist narrowness that is sort of required as a function of, well, one could argue that peer review sort of requires it, among many other things. Marxist economist Paul Sweezy rejects Baum-Bavaric's view that the theory of value must be abandoned, which is, you kind of make up your mind on those matters. However, he considers Karl Marx in the close of his system to be the best statement of the argument that the fact that the law of value is not directly controlling in capitalist production requires the rejection of the theory of value. So the point is that we've returned to where we started a while back, a couple of weeks ago, I suppose. This issue of do you accept or reject theories of value? And it's not as clear as one would think, although in order to get certain, sort of logical paths sort of going, at some moments you do sort of, make a final decision about that. And although we've seen, I think, if you've been following my little thinking on this matter, is that there's plenty of good and bad arguments built up on both sides, and using a variety of methodologies, whether it's a sort of a system dynamics approach or, a variety of other things. How is it that we can make certain types of arguments? And it depends, of course, on issues of scope and scale and a variety of other things. So anyway, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today because I've included, as I said, I started with this one NBER type article that just came out a couple days ago, I think, and you can see that because it returns to an argument based in the classical model and with a very specific thing that you don't have to be a Marxist to talk about average production time, that it's still a worthy kind of argument as long as you start to specify, kind of what you're looking at. And of course, the data is better now. And of course, we have computers. So a lot of these things can be made a little bit clearer. Not that everyone needs a supercomputer to solve the problems, but it is important to sort of wade through some of the very the weeds of ideological and methodological problems that have existed over the last couple of decades. So anyway, I'm introducing that in the terms of the current time. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, I will be looking at uh, chapter 11 of the 2024 new translation of Karl Marx, Volume 1, Capital, the Princeton version by the two Pauls. And the point that I would be making there, because it is the a chapter on cooperation, that we think a little bit about how a lot of this is how we get to an equilibrium is a function, in fact, as Marx might identify it, as a problem in cooperation, which has, of course, other implications in terms of agency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How you define a network or a model or blah, 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 which we've looked at before. So it will still be useful. It still is useful. It doesn't have math, so that will make it easier to read for everyone, and that's also available for your pleasure. So I hope you understand where I was coming from in choosing a range of articles, beginning, of course, with something that's fairly conventional, though it's a little bit more about economic thought. But it has its basis, a century and a half or so later, um, in certain basic ideas about, the issues of production and or production versus Department One is supposed to Department Two. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention on this matter. I will now shut this.